Hello there, woman beings, and welcome to another episode of
The Woman Being
Podcast. Wow, this is the kind of chaos you can expect from us in this book review episode. We are going to be reviewing the book Our Voice of Fire by Brandi Morin. Let's dive into it. This is Woman Being,
where we explore thoughts and opinions
and have the freedom to change our minds.
without expectation or judgment.
We will hold a safe space and support each other
as we navigate together in the form of feminine.
Hello, we are so excited to be here today to talk about this book. But first, as we do with all Not Your Mom Book Club episodes, we talk about what we're drinking. And as you can see, if you're watching us visually, which you should on YouTube or Spotify, but if you don't want to watch us visually, then you can listen to us on Apple Podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram, and you can also go to our website, womanbeingcommunity.com. Oh, and TikTok. So follow us on all the places for all the Woman Being content. But we're going to say what we're drinking today. Because it is the morning, we're drinking mimosas.
The one and only.
With strawberries. They're so fancy.
They're so cute. You know?
So that's very exciting. We're having some mimosas, which is like, I feel like prime, like middle-aged lady book club beverage.
It's like white wine is at the top, and then right after it is mimosas.
Yes,
so I feel
totally.
like this is it. We have arrived.
We're doing it.
The only thing we need is like some brunch.
Yeah,
You know?
like some croissants.
Some little, like a table of like bite-sized
breakfast items.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's what
That
we
is
need.
what we need.
Mhm.
100%. But this book, Our Voice of Fire, is a memoir about Brandi Morin a memoir. Wait, is a memoir always something you write about yourself?
I think so.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's not an autobiography.
No, autobiography would be like the events of my life, like a
I
historical.
think autobiography is more comprehensive.
Yes.
And also you're usually older.
Yes.
Like you've lived more life, whereas she's like, I
Young,
think in her 40s. Yeah. Anyways, so Brandi Morin is an award-winning Cree-Iroquois French journalist. And she
From Canada.
is from Territory 6 in Alberta, Canada. And she sure is. And she has lived a life, folks. You hear about basically like from as early as she can remember in her childhood, like up until now, and all that went on. I think it's a very poignant metaphor for the life of many Indigenous people in North America. But that's essentially what the book is.
Mhm.
Do you two have any? It's a story of triumph.
Yeah.
It's a story of overcoming the odds,
Mhm.
I would say,
Mhm.
and of a powerful woman.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would say like the main thread is kind of how she sort of rose from the ashes, or like, I don't even know. She doesn't even phrase it that way. I don't know if she would call it like a victory. It's more so like, unlike many of her Indigenous brothers and sisters, she was able to get out of a cycle of abuse and neglect and, oppression, and kind of how she got into her career as a recognized journalist, which we love journalists here on the Woman Being Podcast.
We sure do.
Yeah, and I will also want to caveat that as we talk about things in this book, the topics of like rape or sexual assault might come up. So I'm just going to give a trigger warning to anyone who wants to avoid those topics. That is very prevalent in especially the first half of this book. And so those are topics that we'll probably wind up talking about.
Mhm.
So there's your heads up.
Yeah.
Definitely. And you said until now meaning 2020. Yeah, 2020.
No,
is when
I think
the last reference.
Oh, for some reason I thought she referenced 21. But it was
could be
very
wrong.
recent, up
But
until the past
super
couple
recently.
years.
Yeah.
Copyright 2022, Brandi Morin.
Yeah, it came out
wow.
last year, but I don't
Yeah.
know when the writing finished.
Yeah.
But it's up until very recent history,
Sure.
Mhm.
is what she covers.
Ooh, I also want to add this is a story of faith as well.
Yeah, which actually was unexpected to me. I didn't
Same.
know that there was going to be anything. I mean, it's a story of faith but in a very vague way in a lot of ways. It's interesting. We can dive into it more, but it's an interesting blend of seeing different faith practices. So that was intriguing as well. But all of that to say, ladies.
Emma.
So let's just start off with what hit home for you in this book. What were some things that you liked or things that you resonated with? Give it to me.
I mean, I would say that this story overall was very compelling, very easy read. Like, honestly, this is probably the book that's been the easiest of all the Not Your Mom book clubs.
Especially if Emma picks,
books,
for sure.
Yes, especially if Emma picks.
I do pick hard books usually.
She sure does. But this one was fairly quick, very compelling. She's a very good writer. She doesn't linger too long on things, which is both like a love and a slight critique, but we will save that for later. And I mean, I think a lot of the things that hit home for me are her just pulling back the veil of what her life was like. I think what was most surprising out of all of this is the amount of reconciliation that has happened between her and her family, which is pretty awe-inspiring, if I do say so myself, in my opinion. Another thing that really hit home for me that really stood out was her mental health struggles. So she's been in and out of psych wards multiple times since I believe she was a teenager. And so like her really breaking that down and being very open about her mental health struggles, I think was really important, very impactful. I think also like it's a complex story. It's not straightforward. It's not like this person's the hero and this person's the villain. It's kind of like we all have a little bit of everything in us. And someone that would be praised for their work towards social justice and exposing like so many issues in Canada, but also that definitely bleeds over to the US. She's like, I'm a complicated person. Here's where my shortcomings have happened. Here's where my wins and victories have happened. And there's been a lot of in between, which I found really like comforting, actually. It's like, oh, you don't actually have to be all of one thing to do really good things.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that was really valuable was her level of vulnerability and being willing to show, like, I think she even says the words like, even though my professional life was excelling, my personal life still was struggling. And like those things were very incongruent. And so realizing like even someone that you see who seems super successful and like they're doing the things like behind closed doors, they could be having mental breakdowns. Like they could be struggling with an unfaithful spouse. Like they could be having all these other complicated issues that you don't see. So I think that was really great how she pulled back that veil.
Yeah, I agree. Especially like as a young, ambitious woman, like realizing like, hey, you can take 2 steps forward and 1 step back and still keep excelling.
Yeah.
You know, you don't have to have it all together to do really great things. Yeah. So,
and she was so unashamed. Like the one thing I think of is how she talks about in, I think the last chapter, she is writing it from a hotel room on the other side of Canada, and she finally did a flight without having a panic attack. And she like has this huge phobia of flying and can't fly, would drive as far as California to go on reporting trips instead of flying. And that's like so vulnerable to me because that's something I feel like would be easy to be ashamed of. It'd be easy to be like, I'm a grown woman. I should be able to get on a plane and go on a trip. And she's just blatantly like, I'm so excited. I finally did it. And she's very straightforward about it. And so the lack of shame, I think, was also really cool to see.
Yeah. No, this book very much challenged the perfectionism in me and the I guess, high achiever values that I hold, and a lot of even my own fundamentalist sort of mindsets, I would say, because and I loved it for that reason, because a big part of this podcast, we talk about it in the intro, if you ever don't skip through that. Like,
I probably would.
I definitely would, especially if I'd heard it.
Yeah, if you've heard it a million
once.
times, it's okay if you skip through it.
Yeah. But we talk about the gray, and our purpose is to look at things and not place judgment, but just see them and experience them. And I think that this book does that really, really well in the sense that she shares a complicated past. And so in a sense, you kind of want to like excuse her from her like adult behavior that kind of comes out that isn't as good. But at the same time, she takes full responsibility for her choices in addition to acknowledging the oppressive, I guess, systems and experiences that happened to her that made it really hard for her to make any good decision, you know? So you both have compassion for her while also, I don't know, I feel like she takes on a great sense of responsibility that is so hard to do.
Like she even talks about how she feels guilty that she's more available for her youngest child than she was for her older children that she had when she was a teenager.
Yes.
And then her youngest child, I think she had when she was like 36.
Yeah.
And so she's way more emotionally available. She's way more financially stable.
Yes.
And she's like, yes, I feel bad about that. And I've asked for forgiveness from my children.
Yeah.
And I imagine she's seen that same example to an extent, like with her own mother, like you, Kellyanne, talking about her, like reconciling with her family, despite all of the awful things that happen with her being in the foster care system, with her witnessing abuse, being abused, still having such a strong bond with her parents.
That blew me away. Actually, like, I'm like, in my mind, that's like unforgivable.
Yeah, in
like,
my mind, like, I don't have a relationship with my parents anymore.
I'm like,
you know?
Fucking deal.
Yeah.
You made your choices. I'm making mine.
Yeah.
But she approaches family with such a softness, even like praising her father for all the support he gave her as a single mother. And I'm like, you would like live with this man after your childhood. And I mean, I want to point out too, like, she didn't have to go into foster care. Like they chose to send her to foster care. And I'm like, whoa. Like, and I get like every family has their things, but like the fact that, again, it's pretty like awe-inspiring to me, like that she would choose relationship with her family.
Yeah, that really, especially for me, was kind of hurt a little bit. But like in a good way. It was challenging to me in the sense that she could speak kindly of her parents and talk about the ways in which they have like given so much to her or taught her so much. And in the same breath, like talk through some of the really sad, like painful things that happened between her and her parents in their relationship. And so, yeah, it's just a very... I wouldn't say it's like the most amazing piece of literature I've ever read, but her story and her perspective is just so cutting and so like poignant and wise. That, I really, really enjoyed like going along with her on her journey.
Yeah. Yeah. The whole idea of the reconciliation, I have a hunch. I obviously don't know all the things. I don't know all of her family dynamics and everything, but there's one thing that stood out to me later on in the book where she talks about the Rosebud Sioux tribe and how they are had been working to bring the remains of children from their tribe who were found on a residential school grounds. And they, like, the phrase that she uses is that they have kept their memories alive and never lost the determination to bring their children home. And so it was the tribe's children, right? Like this like communal idea of like, this is your family no matter what. Like, I think that there could be some of that plays into the ability to reconcile with her family and like the ability to feel like that is the option because you don't leave them. Like you don't, that's not an option. That's one hunch that I have, but also just seeing the way that the tribes talked about the children, which this is way later on in the book as we go into like the residential schools and the way that children were treated, including her grandmother, which is wild. Seeing the way they talk about them and the way their hearts break for them, even though they've been long gone and even though their parents might not even still be around, that was really beautiful to see as well. But Cal, what did you think of the horses?
Oh my goodness. And I told them this morning, I was like, this book made me cry when I took it out of my backpack. And the biggest part where I was just tearing, I was on a plane when I was reading the end of this book. And So basically she sort of attends and I think writes about like this rehabilitation farm that connects abused horses with abused kids, right? Which is so close to my heart. I think animals are such a powerful experience that the world has to offer. But she talks about being in this ring with this horse, and I guess they like run around her. I've never heard of this practice before.
Well,
but
with multiple horses.
Yeah, there's
they all
like
run
she's kind of in a
around.
ring, and there's a bunch of horses that are let loose, and the person who's, I guess, running it or guiding her or whatever says a horse will choose her, so she just has to wait. And then he goes into like the horse that comes to her, you know, makes the first connection, and this guy goes into like what this horse is like and how it's not surprising to him that this is the horse that chose her, because this is a horse that's a leader and doesn't know it because they've been beaten down so much in their life, but they have so much potential. And just having worked with rescue horses in my life and knowing like how powerful it is to work with a horse that has been through a lot of horrible things, and the amount of like one-on-one, like I know what you're going through and you know what I'm going through is, I don't know, one of the most powerful things to me. So I was just sobbing on the plane reading that because it's just so healing. And horses are so amazing, and she's so amazing. Anyways, when I worked with rescue horses for a good long stint, I would sometimes go to the farm and be working with one and just cry. Just thinking about like what their past had been and how they were trying to rebuild trust, and you know how I was trying to rebuild trust in my own life, and you know it's incredibly powerful.
Definitely.
I feel like you could read an entire book about that.
Yeah.
Literally.
I'm sure there are books about that.
I hope so.
Yeah. Was there anything that was particularly like difficult for you two to read, or anything that like struck a chord?
Yes. Like I mentioned earlier, just the amount of abuse she had suffered, and abandonment and all the things, and how freely and generously she still talks about her family. It was very hard for me to read, which it's like, listen, it's your family. You feel however you want about them. But my little justice heart is like, fuck those guys. So that was really challenging. And then, but also like I felt a lot of compassion for her, because she kind of like, hindsight's 20/20, and she's experiencing essentially very similar struggles as her parents. And so she's like, I was trying to be there for my kids and I was trying to do all these things. At one point she has her kids taken away from her, which in my opinion should not have been taken away from her, but I will digress. And just seeing the very real internal struggle, and how she essentially had to like fight and claw like every day to one, provide for her children, two, take care of herself, and three, just try to do better tomorrow, was very impactful for me. But again, super challenging for me to read. Like my heart still doesn't know where all that information is landing. It's just like sitting and wrestling with it.
Yeah.
Another portion that was very challenging as I noisily flip through my book.
Ooh, give us some book ASMR.
Oh.
Beautiful. The people are loving it at home.
I know they are.
Well, you find your spot. I'll talk about mine. There is a chapter where she talks about several different experiences that she's had in foster care systems, in juvie, in like, I don't know, I think there's like one step above juvie or whatever. So she's been through all of these horrible systems, right? From group homes all the way up to prison, I think. Anyways,
I don't
or maybe
think she
just
was
jail.
in prison.
Jail.
So she talks about these people that she meets along the way who are indigenous, just like she is, and you kind of meet all of these characters who seem to have such troubled lives and are such troubled people, and then it goes at the end of the chapter. She writes how each of them have passed away, and kind of the injustice of the system and how it failed these people.
Yeah.
That was really, really hard for me to read. I mean, just in the sense that looking back and not having survivor's guilt about something like that, but also sort of the stark reality of like, oh, that could have been me. from her perspective.
Yeah.
You know, like she's in the same boat as all these people that are around her, and they've all touched her life in different ways. And like, yeah, the system failed them and is failing so many people, especially in Indigenous communities and BIPOC communities.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that was really tragic, I think. I mean, there's so much that's tragic in the book.
There is a lot of tragedy, especially the first half or maybe even first 2/3 of the book.
Yeah.
At times it was hard to get through because it was just awful thing after awful thing that happened to her. And you would like think she's starting to do better, and then like things would go wrong again. And she definitely makes the point that like this is the story of so many Indigenous people. She even, I'll just read a couple stats and then we can go to your thing, Kellyanne. She says that in Canada, Indigenous women and girls make up just 4% of the population, but account for 24% of female homicide victims. And then the vast majority of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls have been in the foster care system. Indigenous women are 12 times more likely to be missing or murdered than any other woman in Canada. The stats are also very similar in the United States. And it's like, there's obviously a problem. Like, there's obviously like systemic, broad-reaching problems that are leading to Indigenous women suffering in this way. And Indigenous men are also suffering. Like, there's so much suffering from the pain. And you even see, like, I think there's also that generational suffering that you see in this book. Like, you see as her mom tries to do a little better than her mom did, and then you see her try to do a little better than her mom did. And they're trying to fight that generational trauma, and they're trying to push against it. But like, I feel like we've already talked about, but like she could feel herself turning into that same kind of mother. And she's done a lot to fight against it, which is incredible, which is why I say it's also a story of like hope, you know?
Definitely. And I would add to that my grandfather was, it was my great-grandmother who was half Native. So my grandfather was a fourth. And that pattern is actually something we saw in our own family on my dad's side. And so I wouldn't ascribe to say like I'm Native, definitely not. But we have that influence in our family history. And that is a pattern that I did see that we saw follow through on my dad's side of the family some. And it's really real, like, and very painful. Anyways, I digress. The thing that was really, really hard for me, I'm going to read you a good little bit. I apologize. But she perfectly articulated my absolute worst fear. And I actually like had to take a second, sit with my husband, read this to him, tell him about it, and literally talk through it, because it was like, wow. I think in my brain, I'm so young, but I'm like, oh, the worst of my life is behind me. Right? That's my perspective. And realizing life is really long, filled with lots of twists and turns, and actually no one really knows when the worst is behind them. And so kind of like accepting that and like resting in that. But anyway, on page 140, she says, "The pain hit hard and fast as something ripped open deep inside me, and I doubled over. I began sobbing, sucking each breath into lungs that wouldn't expand. I could feel myself beginning to fall into that dark open pit inside me. My youngest brother, Joel, and my oldest sister, Prista? I'm dyslexic, so I'm going to just like throw that out there. Helped me from the room and brought me outside. I could not stop sobbing and was clinging to my brother's strong arms and shoulders because my knees couldn't hold my weight. It felt surreal, like I was watching all of it from a great distance. The next few days, I tried to push on with my life, work, kids, caring for my mom, but the open wound inside pulled at me incessantly. I felt like I was clinging to its edges by my fingertips. I was bombarded with severe panic attacks and bouts of uncontrollable crying during the day and insomnia at night. When I did snatch some sleep, I woke screaming with horrendous nightmares. The days and nights bled into each other. I wasn't eating, I was weak, and my body trembled with grief. Millimeter by millimeter, I could feel myself slipping, and then I fell. Down, 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 from the pinnacle of my recent triumph. I tumbled lower than I had ever gone before, right into the open maw of hell that gaped at the center of my being. I ended up back in the psych ward, that all too familiar, oppressive, and colorless institution, once more in the grip of psychosis. It was a horrifying experience. I saw things that weren't there and heard screaming that no one else did, perhaps because it was coming from inside me. Over and over again, my mind was tortured by dark scenes from my childhood. For weeks, I couldn't sleep if I was alone. I would beg a nurse to come with me and tuck me in and tell me everything was going to be okay. I was a child again, alone, institutionalized, and powerless to help myself. Meanwhile, my mother languished at the other hospital, and I could do nothing to save her. My psychiatrist prescribed me an arsenal of drugs, antidepressants, anti-anxiety, bipolar meds, and sleeping pills. I became a walking zombie. This was not the medicine I wanted, nor the medicine I believed I needed, but I complied with everything. I just wanted to be better. And as someone who has struggled with their mental health, that is a horrifying thing to read and see articulated so clearly. And I understand what that slipping she describes feels like, that I'm actually losing grip of my life. And anyway, it was very challenging to read. And I understood where she was coming from. And so, yeah, she articulated my biggest fear, which is to be hospitalized and drugged. The end.
Yeah, I remember I highlighted that section because it reminded me of something that you and I were talking about the other day, Kellyanne, with Soft White Underbelly, which is a YouTube account that you love.
I love it.
And there's what would we call her? A therapist or a scientist?
She's like a scientist is what I would say.
A scientist who talked about how when someone is so strung out on drugs, when they are having such a mental crisis, they need to be treated as children. And she hit on that where she says, I was like a child again. I could not care for myself in any way. And that like really brought that up to me, and like also brought up to me the severity and the realness of a mental health crisis. Like, even if it is not triggered by drug abuse, like the people that the scientist works with, like it is still a very real health crisis. It is not made up. It is not just someone like, having a chaotic moment or something, which I think people can often write off mental health issues as that. It is someone truly having a medical crisis.
Yes. and that's what is wonderful about this gal that we're talking about, is she is trying to push healthcare to address mental health like physical health. But aside from that, like, I don't think people realize how serious it can be. Like, no, I actually can't will myself to get out of my bed. Like when you're really struggling, that slipping feeling that like I'm tumbling into darkness and I have no control over the velocity of that happening. You feel so out of control. And so like realizing like, oh, we don't get to clutch our mental health and control it. We get to support it. And like it's going to ebb and flow the way it does, just like physical health does as well. And like just kind of being present with that and like trying to accept that as a control freak was really difficult, but very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's, I can understand why that would feel like a scary thing. This idea that like, oh, I've been through something really hard, but injuries, they resurface sometimes, especially in situations of great stress, like she was in when her mom was hospitalized. It's a huge trigger. And so, holding ourselves lightly or
Gently,
you know, not trying to have a iron-fisted grip on everything is a hard thing to do. You know?
Yeah.
But one thing I also, not to switch gears if we're ready to
Please
switch gears, there's a piece of this, I'm not going to read it, but she does outline the first time that she was raped, which to me is like the worst. I mean, there's no best case scenario of being raped, but this is just an awful, she's 12 years old. She's been like brought to this old man's house by her friends, and this man just rapes her. And then she's trapped in this home, unable to say anything
for like a week or something, right?
She doesn't know.
She can't get
assumes
away.
a week.
She can't get away. She can't do anything. They take her to other people's houses, so she's trafficked around to these different people's houses. And I'm sure that these girls were, you know, getting something in exchange for
probably drugs.
for
Drugs
whoring
is
their
my
friend.
assumption.
Yeah, and so tragic. Unfair. And then the hardest part of that, though, I mean, not that the rape was not very difficult to read, but she finally, after weeks, comes up with the courage to share what happened to her with a social worker. And which is probably one of the hardest things that she's done so far in her 12 years of life, you know?
Definitely.
Is she's like, she already feels guilty. She escaped from the group home that she was in and disappeared for 7 days. And while that happened, lots of horrible things happened to her. And so she's already bearing the weight of that. And this social worker, if we can even call her that, tells her, like, listens to her story and says, well, that's why you don't sneak off, isn't it? And just, she describes like the weight of the guilt that she carried, thinking that this confirmed all her worst fears, right? That it was her fault that she was raped, that she did something to bring this upon herself, that because she was a bad kid, because she, you know, didn't have the self-control or whatever, that she deserved it.
Because she didn't have the power to push a grown man off of her as a 12-year-old who doesn't even know what's happening. Like, that's... Yeah, that made me really mad. And I'm like, this person should not be a social worker. Like, they just shouldn't.
And just the rage that I felt towards that, knowing how often, like, tactics like that are used by, like, white do-gooder perfectionist control freaks that think that, you know, your consequences are 100% a result of your own actions. It's too much a symptom of, I think, white colonialist culture to cause so much grief and destruction in this world and then blame it on the people who suffer from it.
Well, why'd you leave the house? I'm like, maybe she left because she was being neglected and abused there too and didn't want to be there. Like,
it's I mean, and the buildup of the trauma of being shipped house to house, the trauma of not getting to be raised by her parents, of watching her parents abuse one another, like
being abused and neglected by her parents.
So it's all of it together. Like, of course she's running. She's trying to figure things out. Like, she doesn't know what else to do.
She's not safe here.
No.
And she's not safe anywhere. Really.
And she's too young to, like,
know.
So,
well, and she trusted these other girls too that were a little older than her and
had probably had the same thing happen to them.
Literally. And, you know, that
I think that it also connects to this theme that she harps on over and over again, which is that indigenous women are just not valued, period. She opens up part of the story with a trip that she went on with a New York Times journalist where they go and interview this woman whose niece, I believe it was, or I don't know if it was a niece or if it was her daughter.
Isn't it Tina Fontaine?
Yeah,
that was a really big story back a few years ago. Was her disappearance, and I think it's one of the big stories that finally drew attention to the disappearance of indigenous women.
Yeah, so they go to her house and she talks about how this has happened to so many other girls. And we see Brandi bring this up over and over again, even to the end of the book when she is at the site of where they're protesting a pipeline, I believe, and they have these red dresses that hang in honor of the indigenous women and girls that have gone missing.
Yep.
And there's a man who's ripping them down. And she confronts him and she's like, why are you doing that? What are you doing? And he's like, those things are trash. They're garbage. And she draws that line to how indigenous women are also considered nothing but garbage. And that was hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and even talking about, I mean, the pipeline, her perspective about the pipeline was so eye-opening too, because I mean, I think mainstream media coverage, I think glossed over a lot of the complexities of that issue. Did gloss over most, if not all of the complexity of the issue. And she talks about how even just the presence of these pipeline builders had wreaked so much havoc in the surrounding communities for women and girls because of just a bunch of entitled men sitting around without much to do. And so taking advantage of women, disposing of them, murdering them.
Yep.
And so even prior to like the building of said pipeline, the existence of this initiative was already causing so much harm. And how I don't think, I mean, maybe never say never, but it just feels like that injustice will never be addressed.
Yeah.
Right? That injustice will never be confronted. The story will go that we could have had, an amazing, cost-efficient way of providing oil to the United States, and we just didn't because
instead
indigenous people
these
can't hang or whatever.
Yeah.
And crazy activists, those crazy environmentalist activists just don't care about what's best for. Well, anyways, so, and obviously that's the worst side of the others. I mean, maybe not the worst, but it's so much more complex than that. And it's so much more nuanced. And the effects that it has on the people in the community, those stories don't get told.
Yeah. Well, and I want to back that up too further, right? So Brandi has written stories that she names Justin Trudeau has been involved in. She's interviewed him. She's met him. And she went to a ceremony that a chief and I think multiple chiefs, but essentially they had a ceremony welcoming Justin Trudeau and honoring him and giving him a name in their tribe, which is a huge, huge deal.
I mean, because Justin Trudeau, unlike most politicians, at least appeared to be an advocate for the indigenous communities at that point in time. Yeah.
Yes. And so that happened. And they're like, great, we have a voice, we have an advocate, we have someone that wants to help champion our communities, protect our lands, all those things. And later on, towards the end of the book, this pipeline it ended up not happening through the company it originally was, and ended up going to a government project that Justin Trudeau was over. And I just anytime people are like, oh, indigenous people are so sensitive, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, it's because they've literally been fucked over time and time again. And this is literally the perfect example of this land is what was promised to them. This was their land. They owned it. Right? If that was the state of Texas, they owned it.
In Canada. It wasn't just, because I think people often write things off as oh, well, indigenous people can't just say they own it and then they own it.
Yeah, and that's not the case.
And that's not even the case in this instance, although we should respect the land of the people that were originally there. Yes. But they were in a legal agreement with the nation of Canada.
Canadian Constitution.
Yes. Well, and similar with the United States, we have sovereign nations within the United States that are native nations.
Yes.
They are their own entities, and we need to respect their land.
Yeah, but
otherwise it's an invasion.
And that's what was happening.
Yeah.
And so, I think people need to reframe the way they see that they see this whole like type of situation. Because if you don't have that backing and that understanding of like, oh, wait, this actually legally belongs to this tribe, then you're going to be like, well, what is the big deal? And I'm like, no, it's a really big fucking deal. And so I think that really eloquently painted the picture of like, these people actually should be pissed off. Yeah. Like they have literally been like taken advantage of time and time again, and any pretend reconciliation that has been like given forth by politicians, what have you, is like it's for press, essentially.
Yeah, she gives a great, what I would call a burn towards Justin Trudeau, where she just says, respecting Indigenous rights has to happen on all fronts, not just when it makes a good photo opportunity or helps to get votes.
Yep.
And she's like, mic drop, Justin Trudeau, you can't just say you're going to help us and then get our votes. You're not going to get it again.
Yeah.
Like, you have broken trust.
Yeah.
And so, but also, like, what good options are there? Because historically, politicians in Canada, in the United States, they don't truly respect the Indigenous people. They don't truly respect the land that they have and the agreements that they've made. So,
ugh.
Yeah. It's kind of a lose-lose.
It is a lose-lose. But something really beautiful that I really liked how she articulated was it seemed that she started to discover more of her culture as an adult after her grandmother passed, and started digging into more Native communities and stories. And she really beautifully articulates on page 119, the more I connected with my Indigenous culture, the more I felt something powerful awakening within. It was almost like a reunion, ancient, rich, and beautiful, and I couldn't get enough. And I loved reading how she began to fall in love with her own heritage, which I would imagine is something particularly challenging when one, she also states often that she is also French, and she kind of breezes over like, so I have to reconcile the Indigenous and the colonist inside me. But also when your grandmother was shipped away to a school where she was abused and tried, like basically they tried to remove her culture from her. Yeah. Like I would imagine that does a lot of damage to... I would imagine it has done a lot of damage to a lot of Indigenous communities. And so I feel like this generation is really trying to push forward and connect with their heritage. And I think that's really beautiful that she's doing that work.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think even when we had Tanasha on our podcast all these years ago.
Wow, that was episode 1 of the Woman Being podcast. If you want to hear where we started, if you haven't, go listen to episode 1 with Tanasha Leray and just give us a free pass on the audio quality. Because we didn't know what we were doing, we still don't, but we know a little more now.
Yeah, we know a lot more.
But I mean, one of her big takeaways, or like her big pieces of I don't know, wisdom that she passed on to us in that podcast was like, even as white people, explore your heritage, like learn where you come from, like learn who the people were that you descend from. I feel like that's just so important across the board, right? Like,
yes,
knowing. I mean, some of it's going to be really painful to look at. You know, some of it's going to suck, but some of it we might find lessons learned there. But anyways, yes, I think this generation in general is sort of in a movement of reconnecting with their past, finding out who they are. And, you know, it doesn't define you, but it's, I mean, hugely a part of who you are, I think. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but.
No, definitely. I completely agree. Like, and I think me and my husband have been on a journey ourselves for the past like couple years, doing a lot of Ancestry.com stuff. And it's really empowering and it's really cool. And yes, like you said, some of it's very painful. Like James and I found that like when he, you know, because he's his dad is Black, and so way back in his heritage line, my family and his family were both in Kentucky, and I was like, oh, that's sticky. But like reconciling that, right? Like that's that's difficult to sit with. Like, and obviously we don't know all the stories or the things that may or may not have happened, but like that awareness and like, again, just like kind of making peace with it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important.
Yeah. So I want to shift a little bit.
Shift.
To a little spicy question.
Oh.
Maybe spicy. I don't know. Obviously, one thing that we talk about a lot here on the podcast is religion. And there is a good amount of religion in this book. So I'm curious to hear from you two how you felt about the faith aspects of the book and how those things struck you, maybe, if at all.
I also was not anticipating it, so it was a little bit of a surprise. But I think, I don't know, I kind of like just gave it its space, and it didn't like severely impact my experience of this book, but it also was like, it didn't add to it for me, if that answers the question.
So it felt irrelevant to you, essentially. Like that. So basically, to give a little more clarity, Brandi is, I believe, a Christian now. Mm-hmm. And so she mentions God and she mentions praying. Mm-hmm. She mentions people she knows from her church.
Mm-hmm. She talks about Jesus specifically in a couple instances.
Yeah, I don't even remember those.
No,
wow.
She does. And she does provide a caveat in there, too, of why she chooses to talk about her faith and why she has stuck with her faith and how she kind of rejects the colonial Christianism. And basically, she dresses like, I mean, a lot of the pain that a lot of people validly feel about kind of the harm that the white North American or Western church has caused. And she basically says, I see all that, but I don't think that people taking God's name in vain, or in a sense, like not living by the values of Christ, doesn't make that the values of Christ. Mm-hmm. And she's like, so I separate those people and how they have abused and misinterpreted and twisted God from my faith with God. Yeah. So she does sort of like leave a little caveat in there, and she addresses Jesus specifically in it. But throughout most of the book, she's a little bit more vague. Yeah. She's more like the divine or the creator or God.
Which I tend to resonate with, words like the divine or creator or whatever. But like, I think it's super relevant to her, which is obviously important. So I wouldn't say it's irrelevant. I would just say it didn't add to anything for me personally. It was like, okay, like this was a part of your journey. I can still see a lot of value in your journey. But like, I think that's a valuable perspective to have about faith. But for me, it was just kind of like, okay.
I always love... not always, but so often love hearing non-white expressions of faith and how it sort of practically shows up in non-white people's lives. Mm-hmm. Again, this is more of the generalization. Everybody has their own faith journey, but generally. I think mainly because white communities tend to have a very fundamentalist view of God and fundamentalist view of the scripture, and it's very black and white, and it's very specific, and there is a right and a wrong, and good and bad, and God hates the bad and loves the good, basically. And anyone who thinks differently or lives differently within this specific set of rules that typical white religious communities have kind of established is not a true Christian or doesn't belong or whatever. And so I always enjoy listening to people who have embraced their relationship with God or Jesus from a non-fundamentalist viewpoint, which I would argue Brandi comes from. Yeah. Because it due to the types of oppression and abuse that so many non-white people have been through, it really, I think, reflects the true heart of what I understand Jesus to like redeem people from. And also it's so fluid and it's so human. And so, I really enjoyed her her kind of outlining her faith and how prayer was so much a part of her spiritual practice, and how it didn't feel like it was a story of I was bad and I had all this shame, and then finally I became good and then was restored. It really felt like a story of God has been with me this whole time. And he's been advocating for me and saving me and taking me out of really hard situations, regardless of my behavior, and regardless of my theology and whether or not I believed about him correctly or incorrectly. It's a very human, personal, more relationship. So I always love to listen to understandings of faith that way, because it's so hard for me personally to view faith outside of my fundamentalist roots. And I have a really hard time accepting Christianity as anything other than that, which is a really big reason I don't really identify as a Christian anymore, even though I acknowledge like the background that I have in it. But yeah, I thought it was really beautiful in a lot of ways. And I feel like I continue to learn what faith could look like, or what it might look like for other people, because it's so foreign from what my faith looked like. So, yeah.
Yeah, I remember I was quite surprised when she started talking about the Christian God, because in the introduction of the book, she talks about when they go to interview that woman, she says like she opened the door and she felt like that woman's spirit come into her spirit and like back out, and like this very beautiful, very spiritual statement, and it felt very outside of what I would think of as typical Christian language. And so I read that and I was like, ooh, like I like that. Like I like wonder if we're gonna learn more about like what her faith practice looks like as an indigenous woman, like if she still practices the religion of her ancestors, or what that looks like. And we don't really get that. Instead, we do get her mentioning that she is Christian and talking about it, talking about how prayer is a very important thing for her. And I do want to actually read a little passage from her that outlines that thing that you're talking about, Kelly, in terms of how she views God being, how she views other people perverting God. On page 79 of the Kindle edition, she says, "Many evils have been done in the name of power, in every age and in every society. Twisting and perverting love is not a reflection of love. It is simply a reflection of those who defile it. The systems and the people that committed those evils do not represent the God I know. They tried to wrest power from God for their own agenda, one so monstrous it could have been orchestrated in the pits of hell itself. But my Creator is not about death and punishment. He is about life, healing, and restoration, and I have experienced this over and over again." So it was fascinating to me to hear how present her Christian faith was, the fact that she's aware of the imperialistic roots of it, and the fact that faith has only come to her through imperialism and colonialism. I imagine potentially it came directly from her grandmother, Kokum, being in what?
A convent. She uses quotes whenever she refers to convent.
Yeah, she calls it a convent. It was a residential school, which we now know are horrible places that Indigenous children were sent to in Canada and in the U.S. And that religion was instilled into her Kokum through abuse, essentially. And you even hear her talk about how her grandmother also had a strong faith in God. And so that's just fascinating to me to see them hold that complexity of recognizing the origin of that religion, but also seeing the merits of it, and seeing. At the same time, I got like nervous at certain points. I was like, is she going to try to preach to me or something? Like, I don't know. And she didn't. It is not a Christian book, I wouldn't say. But at some points I got scared that it was going to be. And I was like, shoot, what did we do? Why did we pick this? But it was definitely interesting to see that dynamic. And then at the same time, like, even if you think about politically, she obviously touches on politics to an extent because she's a journalist. There's an instance where she gets pulled over by the police while she and another woman are like scouting out a area where a pipeline is being built. And she talks about how nervous she's always been around the police, which is something that feels un-Christian in this age of Christian nationalism in the United States, where the idea is that the police can do no wrong if you are a good Christian. And she is twisting that and saying, actually, the police are not a safe thing to me as an Indigenous woman. I don't trust them. I'm going to record them during an interaction. I'm going to be very nervous the entire time because I know the history of what it's been like for my people to interact with the police. So that was fascinating to me as well. Like she didn't address like the fact that she's going against the grain, I don't think really in that sense. Like she addresses it in that paragraph and in that little bit of time where she mentions the colonial roots of her religion. But the rest of the time she's like, this is just part of me. This is just part of who I am.
Yeah.
And she takes it very like, this is just all my story.
Yeah. And hearkening back to you mentioned kind of some of the language that she used that sounded, I don't know, spiritual, just like closer to native spiritual practice, I guess. She has several different instances of that throughout the book. Like she talks about having a dream where she's able to like commune with her kokum after she dies, and
the
that's
ancestors' bones dancing around the property of her father's home. Yeah,
and she has like these sort of spiritual experiences that I think a lot of Christians might sort of deny as something that is Christian and might find to be more demonic or more like not with God or whatever. But I think, again, and this goes with the theme that I'm talking about, I think oftentimes in BIPOC communities, I've seen more of that infusion of faith and like native practice infused, which I think is really beautiful. And I think, again, it really pushes against my fundamentalist roots, which I think is very valuable. So I think the one concern that I would have of the book with the extent to which she talks about her faith is that white Christian nationalists, not that they would be reading this kind of book, but like if they did, they might feel some sort of affinity with her, or like some sort of like, oh, she's one of us sort of experiences, knowing that that's what I've done with certain books like this in my past, of like, oh, well, no, they might be a Christian, and like not really recognizing how not similar our faiths were, you know? But I mean, again, I don't think this is really a white nationalist sort of beacon of literature, but
definitely not.
But you know what I mean? Like there's kind of a...
Yeah, I think that actually is a good bridge into any critiques that you two have of the book. Anything that was... Maybe that was your critique, but anything that felt a little like, I will say, I'll start.
Go for it.
Thank you. We're also in sync.
I know, wow.
One critique that I will have is that much of it read like an article. I think that it was pretty dry sometimes compared to other memoirs that I've read that are much more flowery in their language, much more poetic, still telling the story of someone's life. Even actually a perfect example would be the last book club book we did, Know My Name by Chanel Miller. You should go listen to that one too.
Yes, you should.
Read that book though.
Read the book,
so
listen to the episode.
If nothing else, read the book, but yeah, sure,
listen to the episode. Listen to the episode, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. So that book was so like, it felt like literature. Like you mentioned, Kelly, at the start of the podcast. This didn't feel as much like a literary piece that was meant to be sort of savored in the same way. It definitely was an important piece of work. I think that the things that she talked about were super valuable, and I enjoyed reading it. It was a fairly easy read, but it did feel a bit like an article to me, probably because she's a journalist. Yeah. She's not this like writer in that realm. She's not gonna write like a fiction book or something that is just like full of metaphors and all these other things. Yeah. Like she's pretty straightforward. And so that's one, I guess, critique in terms of personal preference is like, it wasn't as like quotable, you know?
I was going to say the exact same thing.
Yeah.
I literally had the thought as we started this podcast. I was like, she really writes like a journalist, and which is great. That is going to lend towards her strength. But yeah. And part of the benefit of that is it's an easy read.
It is.
It's very quick to read. It's
easy.
It's to the point. And so for any of those people that like a to the point sort of like whatever book, this is your gal.
But still tackling very heavy topics.
Very deep.
So
very
it's not
thoughtful.
a light read, but it is easy in some ways.
If you want to go deep, but you don't want to have to like think too hard, this is your book. It's plain and simple, despite exploring very heavy topics, I would say. And so yeah, I think as a journalist, she's incredible, and I think the way that she formatted her story was well done. And but yeah, it's definitely it doesn't give you that sort of emotional bent like Chanel Miller or like Tara Westover or other like memoir writers that we've reviewed.
Yeah,
that I love, but.
Yeah, I would agree for sure. I liked that it was to the point, but also I wish she would have said more. You know what I mean? Like, I think that was like, and then this horrible traumatic thing happened. Moving on, and I'm like, whoa, what? But what about it? What happened?
Yeah.
Tell me more. Like, and so that's more of what I was wanting. Like, I didn't mind her straight to the pointness, but she just like breezed over like things that I'm like, say more about that, please. Because obviously she is a really fascinating, like compelling story. And I'm like, I actually just want to suck all the juice out of that and just know everything. So that was one thing. Another thing is if you do not have a little bit of knowledge of our history as North America, I don't know if you will appreciate this book as much as if you do have a little bit more knowledge and understanding, like realizing like things like, oh my gosh, Justin Trudeau was given a name like from a chief. This is such a big deal. Like things like that of like the significance or like understanding. Like I think a lot of people think, oh, well, reservations are really dangerous places because like these people live like they did, you know, however long ago. And that's why women go missing. I'm like, no, that's not the case. And so like, I think having a little bit more background and understanding before you dive in really helps. And so that is like not necessarily a critique towards her, but maybe like, this isn't like first pickup, I would suggest for
if you have no knowledge of our history with Indigenous people.
If you have no understanding.
Yeah, that's actually a really good call out. Because definitely, as I was reading it, I was like, ooh, I wish I had a little bit more context about this specific issue or that, you know, thing. Yeah. She kind of referenced world events as if it was like, you should know about this.
Yeah.
And it was like, yeah. And I think because of our poor coverage in the mainstream media and because of a multitude of factors, you really... Yeah, you kind of have to, and I still want to like dig a little bit more into like the complexity of the issue surrounding her story. Because I think it adds a lot of riches to it.
For sure. Yeah, it's really beautiful that way. I did also feel like a shift in her storytelling when it was like, here's like my entire journey as a journalist, and this is how I worked up to like where I am now. And then it was like, the last maybe 3 chapters, it was like, and then all this stuff happened, now the book's done. And I was like, wait. So I felt like it ended really quickly. It was like a long up ramp and then just like, and the book's done. So I guess maybe, again, like I wanted to feel like a little bit more space, but it was...
Much like a piece of journalism.
Maybe,
get all the facts out.
Much like that.
From, you know, like you set the stage, you get all the facts out, and then
all right.
Moving on.
There you go.
Was good.
No conclusions. You know, she doesn't really draw conclusions for you in the way that Chanel Miller did. She doesn't really share her thoughts about things in the way that you like kind of want it to be wrapped up. She's sort of like, here are the facts of the case. Do with it what you will.
She does a little bit towards the very end. And actually, the very end was the only part that made me cry in the book. And it was, I guess I can read it. It was, I feel like it's actually, I cried reading it, but I think part of why I cried is because it's very general. And it felt like I could apply that to myself. And it was also like maybe a little cliche, but cliche in the sense of it's a sentiment that I've heard many times. But on page 145 of the Kindle edition, she says, and I think she's trying to also draw in the title of the book, which I do feel like she didn't do a great job bringing in why this is the title of the book. She starts mentioning it at the very end, and I'm like, but we didn't talk about fire like ever before this.
That's a great critique, actually.
Yeah.
I disagree, though.
Really?
She does bring up fire after her grandmother passed. And she talks about her grandmother praying for them in her native tongue that they hadn't heard.
Right.
And she does talk about fire then. However, I agree with you. She doesn't connect the dots very well.
It's not very connected in that sense.
Yeah.
But this is what the quote is. She says, "This is the generation of fire, and we are rising to take our place in this troubled world. We are journalists, doctors, lawyers, CEOs, dentists, artists, and teachers. We are the caretakers of the sacred lands, the waters, and the medicines given to us by our Creator. We are the walking prayers of our ancestors. Our blood memory holds their wisdom, and we call on them to help solve the current environmental, political, and economic crises that threaten the existence of all. We rise to take our rightful place, leading the way to a better world." And that was one thing that I loved about that quote is that she lists these occupations, and then she lists like the earth. Like she says that within the same breath, saying we are journalists and CEOs and doctors, and we are the land and the water, and like we are this sacred thing. And so I love her connection in that. And also it's sort of her, I think, trying to wrap everything together. But yeah, I'm not sure that she was as successful. Also, ending a book is really hard.
That's my weakest, like ending things is like my worst skill. I've never been good at it. So yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah,
we
I
feel
like
for
what
that.
she said, though. We are the walking prayers of our ancestors.
Yes.
And I think
that's beautiful.
it's really beautiful. And I think we can all feel that a little bit. Like we have like generations before us that we have inherited beautiful things and ugly things from, but we are someone's prayer.
Right.
And I think I don't feel that with like a sense of like Christianity. I feel that with a sense of just like, yeah, that's just the reality of
it's legacy.
of what it means.
Yeah, it's intention.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's good.
All right. So we've laid it all out there. We've discussed all the things that hit home, all the things that we didn't love as much. We've talked about faith. We've talked about injustice. Any final takeaways from the book? And also, is this book woman being approved? Why are you laughing?
I just love that we always ask the question.
I don't, but I feel obligated at this
I mean,
point.
I am here for it. I think for me, the biggest takeaway was like we mentioned earlier, that like that presence of both like light and dark, that we are a mixture of everything. And that doesn't mean we can't achieve wonderful things, but the reality of we're very human and like loving that and creating space for that. And that is a takeaway, as well as like Kelly mentioned, like being more in touch with like your history. Like anytime I read something like this, I'm like, yeah, actually, I do want to try and get in touch with my grandmother. Or, you know, like things like I want to make sure my children know our story and how we got to where we are. And that legacy or that living prayer, like we mentioned earlier, is very important. So for me, this is one being approved. I think it's a great like read, gets you thinking, and gives really wonderful perspective. So
I second that. Definitely woman being approved. Yeah, it's an incredible story of resilience, overcoming immense challenges, and embracing your humanity in the midst of that. And I think everything that woman being stands for is in this book, right? Mm-hmm. It's the gray, it's humanity, it's presence, being, and journalism, and digging into stories and advocating for lesser heard peoples. I 100% recommend. I'm gonna be giving this to my mom to read and my sister to read. I'm gonna be like, here, just
Read
pass this out.
Yeah, it's definitely woman being approved, and I think that it's a great example of that vulnerability, the path that any woman has to take to succeed in a patriarchal world. And then on top of that, all the factors that come along with being an indigenous woman in a white-dominated society, in poverty and abuse, all the things that were working against her. This really is a story of hope and resilience, and a story of fighting past those things, and all of the pain that comes with that, while also being a piece of this very broad story of Indigenous people in North America and honestly all over the world. And so it's a beautiful one. I'm glad that we read it. That's it, folks. That's the book review.
That's the whole book review.
Yeah.
Yes, big recommendation.
Yes,
here.
you should definitely read it. You can easily read it in a couple days.
Yeah.
If you probably,
You can
if you
read it
really
in one
wanted to,
sitting.
you could read it in
You
one
could
sitting.
read this in a
Definitely
day for
can.
sure. I mean,
Yeah.
if you could stomach it.
Yeah.
It was nice to take some breaks throughout, but I think I read over half of it on my plane ride home, which took about a couple hours. So.
Yeah. So it is a pretty easy read while being a heavy read, as we keep saying and contradicting ourselves with. It just makes sense somehow. If you've read the book, you'll understand.
You'll get it.
Yeah, but big fan of Brandi.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
she's
can't
great.
wait. Can't wait to see what she does next.
Same.
Agreed.
So maybe next she'll be interviewed on Woman Being Podcast. Who
You
can
know,
say?
I looked her up on Instagram. We might be able to snag
we might be
her.
snagging her.
Okay, here's your mission, Woman Beings. Go to her Instagram. Tell her, have you ever heard of Woman Being Podcast? You should be on there. And try to find an emoji that simulates the shoulder shimmy that I just did. So just go just kidding. Actually, don't bother her too much or at all, because then she might hate us. We flood her
We
DMs.
definitely want her to like us.
Yeah. But anyways, thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming along on the ride. Thank you for reading the book if you did. And we hope that this, gave you some more perspective on Indigenous women and their experience in North America. And with all that being said, be sure to give us a follow on Instagram, on the TikTok. That's where all the kids are these days. Follow us on Apple Podcasts. Give us a review. Give us a review on Spotify.
You literally just click the star. It's so
amazing.
easy.
Give us a star review, a 5-star review on Spotify. We're on all the other podcast platforms. Anything you can dream of, we're probably there. Just search Woman Being Podcast. But you probably already know that because you're listening to us right now. Send it to everyone you know. Anyone who you think would benefit from this kind of content, slide into their DMs. Wink. I guess I shouldn't do visual things.
You're like,
I'm like
silence.
raising my eyebrows and winking while speaking into a microphone. That was really good
Excellent.
podcast content.
No, it's perfect. I love it.
Anyways,
if any of you are
Kellyanne.
even still listening.
I know. I always skip by the end. Are you still listening? Kellyanne, Kelly,
Emma,
thank you for being here today.
Thank
you
you,
for
Emma.
being here today.
And with all that being said, we will see all of you next frickin' week for another frickin' episode of the Woman Being
episode.
Podcast.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.